I messed up a setting, I'm realizing, and I'm going to fix it in real time, I hope. See if I can do this while I'm talking. There we go. My face was taking up the entire YouTube screen, and nobody wants that. Welcome, everybody, to Old Man Squad Fantasy Basketball. I am Dan Vespers, at Dan Vespers on Twitter. You can follow at Old Man Squad as well. And that one, if nothing else, will follow you back. Today, I am joined by an old buddy of mine, a long time coming. He's back, the great Matt Lawson. Matt, it has been entirely too long. It's so nice to see you, Punham. How you been, my man?
Dan, I'm doing great, and I have to say, it's like being back with an old friend. But just so you know, I've been admiring you from a distance. I've been listening, so I'm fully up to date on everything with you. And I'm excited that I now get to make this a two-way relationship where I get to actually speak back to you instead of just listening to you every day. I've been listening to Dan since I think the very beginning, all the way back in the hoop ball days, and I love this podcast. I love Dan's philosophy on fantasy basketball, even though it differs from mine in some ways, but that's what I've always enjoyed about it. I've had an inner debate and dialogue with Dan listening to this podcast for so many years. So it is a dream come true to be able to actually come on the show and to be able to continue that debate in real time.
Well, let's get that debate out into the universe. Matt, of course, is on Twitter at NBA Dynasty ADP. He is with Fantasy Basketball International. He is a Dynasty maven. You're like, and if you can flatter me, I can flatter you as well. I think you're one of the personalities that really brought Dynasty more into the mainstream. We're not going to be talking about that on today's show, but I know without like getting too like puffy headed, the two of us here, like I didn't know that much about it before you made it a bigger thing. Do you feel like you've done that kind of lifting for it?
I will say this. I mean, about 4 years ago is that I started making Dynasty content. I had been playing Dynasty sports for much longer, Dynasty fantasy football, and I kind of discovered Dynasty fantasy basketball almost accidentally through Josh Lloyd having some leagues open, started getting involved in that, and just found this rabid community that desperately wanted resources that just didn't exist for fantasy basketball, but did exist for fantasy football. So it's been my goal over the last 4 years to try to provide those resources for a community that is in desperate need of them, that wants them to be able to enhance their experience of playing these dynasty leagues, which really mirror the way that we follow the NBA. It's about tracking your favorite players. It's about following off-season transactions. It's about looking at who's tanking and building up draft assets. That's what Dynasty brings to the table, and it's often the way that we actually follow the league. So once people get into it, they start to tap into the same thing that makes them enjoy the NBA as a whole, but in a fantasy context.
I have a Dynasty follow-up question before we get into some of your Yahoo board swings or misses. By the way, we are going to be doing the new Yahoo board with Matt today. That's the main topic, the topic du jour. But how would you, because this is the thing for me, how would you talk a redraft person into trying a Dynasty league? What's the sales job there?
I think the sales pitch is the satisfaction that you get out of finding that gem in redraft, of having that player who pops, who jumps up from a late round selection into being a mid to early round value, and then getting to carry that victory over your friends, not just in a single season, but for the rest of their career. You know, imagine how good it feels to be able to get the guy who breaks out, to take Shai Gilgeous-Alexander as a lottery pick, kind of the back end of the lottery, going to the Clippers, and then having that guy turn into a top 5 fantasy player. And it's not just one season, and then you have to let someone else take him the following year. You get to be able to keep coming back for that entire career of that player to be able to run victory laps around your friends. So it's really about sustained victory over the people you love. And that's what I enjoy so much about it.
beat the people you love into a pulp. That is actually a pretty damn good sales pitch. All right, let's talk some Yahoo stuff. You are, as with all guests, steering the boat on today's show. I know you have like 5 really big ones, and then you have like an infinite number of smaller ones. We'll start wherever you'd like to go. I'll be watching the clock, so you don't have to. Where do you want to start?
Well, I think the big thing about the Yahoo update that surprised me is that there were some players where we anticipated that there might be a leap up. And it didn't happen in some areas. And, maybe we just need to keep this quiet, because for some of these, we don't want to expose the values that are going to really give us a huge advantage in Yahoo drafts this year. But the big one for me was Jaylen Williams. Having him at number 43 still on the new board, this is a player that I think is going to have a very good chance at second round value this year. And I think there is, as crazy as it sounds, even room above that, certainly in future years. But I think that this is misunderstanding the changes in Oklahoma City and also the trajectory in his fantasy stat set that we are seeing Jaylen Williams on. To have him be a fourth round pre-ranked pick, I think that it's obviously a good value in the third round. And he's someone who I think even you could get that second round value this season. For Williams, it's the percentages, obviously. We've already seen a stat set that in a smaller role plays really well in 9 category. To be able to have strong percentages, a steal rate that, while fluctuating, still has been strong. He's near the league lead in deflections every single year. But last year, we saw a few things that changed the game even more. The free throw percentage is coming up more, and it's suggestive that as he gets to the line more, which I think he will, with the ball more as he develops, we could have a plus free throw percentage player, not just a solid one, but a real contributor in that area. The assist rate. This was a huge change because initially as a rookie, you had Josh Giddey running a lot of second units. Jaylen Williams took that on when Shea was off of the floor more last year. But now we still had Giddey getting a lot of playmaking usage in transition. That is a vacuum that was not filled by anyone who was brought in by Oklahoma City this year. Alex Caruso isn't going to be taking on that playmaking usage. He's a good connective passer, but he's not doing what Josh Giddey was doing. Giddey was also driving a handful of times a game. That's not really Caruso's game either. So we're going to have Jaylen Williams taking on even more, especially in a playmaking area where the assist numbers could continue to rise. And there are places here. The three-point shot is solid. The percentage is really good. The volume is low. That could come up with Chip England in Oklahoma City. The scoring, I believe, is going to come up. And this is already one of the most efficient players in the NBA from the perspective of being able to score from multiple zones at an efficient rate. So I'm extremely excited about where this is headed with Jaylen Williams. He's someone from a dynasty perspective that I've loved since even before he was drafted. And then having him come into the league, you could see in the first few months that we were on a completely different trajectory than it looked like. And what I compare it to, what I think of him as, is kind of that prime Jimmy Butler from a fantasy perspective.
Juicy.
That's what we're getting with Jaylen Williams. And it could be a more modern version of it as he stretches it out to 3 a little bit more. But he's just going to check so many boxes across a 9-category stat set. This is just the beginning of it. We're not really even into his prime. I don't think this is even going to be a prime season yet at only 23 years old. There's so much good yet to come, but there's so much good coming this year, especially at a pre-rank of 43.
You know I love Jaylen Williams. You're preaching to the choir on that one. Why don't you think he jumped up? Is it because he's not hyper elite in any one category? Is it sort of like that head-to-head bias for a guy who is just like a roto mega darling, but maybe doesn't have the he's not super elite in rebounds or assists or something like that. So there's not one thing that catches the eye?
Yeah, I think it's also just the not tracking where the ball is headed, seeing where it was. You're right. Last year, a roto darling, that really balanced stat set, not really jumping out in any particular area, but you see the sight line of where it's headed, that he could end up being an elite producer in points, in assists, maybe free throw percentage, in steals, definitely. That's where this could be heading. And some of it could already head there this year. And even if it doesn't, the floor is already so high because he's been there. So that extra stuff, those extra areas and categories where we see it could be rising, eventually we're never going to be able to get him in the 4th round anymore. We're never going to be able to get him in the 3rd round anymore. This is going to be that low point. It's only going to go up from here. So let's all get in while the getting is good, because Jaylen Williams is going to have a really, really nice season for the Thunder.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. At some point on today's show, I might try to play devil's advocate, but it's not going to be on this one because I freaking love Jaylen Williams. And as a 9-cat roto guy, even if he doesn't make a massive leap anywhere, he was still 3rd round the last 4 months last season. He was already better than where he was being drafted. Everybody knows the way I look at it is I like to try to see something before I believe it. We've seen it already with him, but yeah, I mean, if people don't want to push him up the board, that's totally fine with us. Matt, where do you want to go next?
I want to talk a little bit about Darius Garland because he's a guy that I think the hate has gone a little bit too far on, and this is kind of a classic fantasy trope where we have a player who's shown us a level in a couple of different seasons and in a couple of different contexts of a player who's kind of an earlier round value, kind of a traditional guard stat set. Last season, he kind of had a mystery injury. I think it was to his hand that was messing with his handle a little bit. He just didn't look like himself. And then he got his jaw broken. He's drinking through a straw, not able to eat solid food. It sounds like an absolute nightmare, even if you weren't a professional athlete. And he kind of went through the season from hell. I think the perception is Darius Garland can't play with Donovan Mitchell, but we already saw Darius Garland play with Donovan Mitchell. The prior season, a strong season, maybe not quite at the level and the usage level that we had seen in his breakout season, all-star season before that, before Donovan Mitchell arrived. But they do work together because Garland works off ball. He is able to provide value with his stat set, even with another usage monster next to him. So now you have Garland at 61, which I think bakes in some improvement, obviously, off of what we had last year, but it's not nearly the level that we had seen in the prior two seasons. I think the one reason for pause here with Garland is that you have Kenny Atkinson coming in, who, when we previously saw him in Brooklyn, is willing to spread minutes out a little bit more. So maybe instead of 35 minutes a game, we're dumping down to 34, even 33. But even at that level, when I look at the Cavs guard rotation, there's only so much leaning on Karis LeVert you can do before he breaks. And Sam Merrill is going to be a guy who's going to come off of the bench, put up some threes, but you can't extend Sam Merrill into minutes into the 20s. That he's going to have to play minutes in the teens. He has a very particular role on this team. So I think Donovan Mitchell, who's likely going to miss some time like he usually does, is going to have to play fewer minutes because they're going to try to keep him upright, keep him healthy, keep him being the guy that we saw at his best last year. Garland is going to have to still take on a significant load in that regard. I think the minutes come down a little bit because that's the way Atkinson wants to do it. But this is someone who I see as a really nice value when the assists start drying up, when the guard stats start to dry up in your draft. You're going to be able to get Garland in the mid rounds at this pre-rank. And he's a player that I think could have some nice ceiling above the pre-rank because we've already seen it in seasons prior.
Do you think the turnovers, because they did come down as the season went on? Last season was a weird one for Garland, and you got into a bit of it there on the injury stuff. He actually didn't get off to that bad of a start, and I think that's maybe something that I'm likely guilty of forgetting. His numbers at the beginning of the year were colored by almost 4 turnovers a game, and so if you ignored that, the other stuff was pretty darn similar to the prior year. 21 points, 6 assists. He was actually at 1.6 steals the first couple months of the year, which, that maybe that doesn't stick, but whatever. Shot the ball 46, 47%. Like that was higher. And then there was this drop off in almost all of the counting stuff and percentages, and the turnovers also came down. And so they ended up looking, they being turnovers, less ridiculous. How do you see talking to Matt Lawson at NBA Dynasty ADP, how do you see that balancing out with him? Do the turnovers go back up as the other stuff comes up and you just kind of have to deal with that? Or is it all going to kind of level out a little bit?
Well, I think that this is actually, and it's only rumor, but there was kind of a drumbeat from some of the beat reporters and people on the inside in Cleveland early in the season that Garland was playing through a hand injury and that was messing with his handle, that was causing him to have a looser handle, have more turnovers, which was a little bit unusual for him. Not a particularly super high turnover player prior to that. I expect that to be able to level out, and you can kind of look at where he was at prior, but we have to remember too that this is a guy who's exceptionally young. I mean, it seems like he's been in the league forever. He has been in for a while, but he's 24 years old, and often you can see point guards. It's one of the toughest positions to be able to get over the learning curve with. I think assist to turnover ratios often do improve as you're getting into those prime years. And I think that's something that we can see with Garland this year, especially with better health. So not a particular area of concern for me, especially because you're just going to inherently be picking up some turnovers with your players are going to be a little bit higher on the assist end, but I don't think he's going to be an outlier in that regard, the way that he was early last season.
One more thing on Darius Garland, and this is more from a team build standpoint, because I like to hear how other analysts are thinking about their team. He's the kind of guy that I don't necessarily go into a draft targeting, but if you happen to get, say, an okay number of assists early without an extraordinarily high number of turnovers, it seems like someone like Garland could actually become even more enticing. Like starting with Tyrese Halliburton, Garland is the kind of guy maybe you could pair him with later because Halliburton's getting a lot of assists without that many turnovers, or is that just not even something that gets into the calculus for you?
Well, from a head-to-head perspective, yes, I need to be a little bit concerned about how many early round players that I'm getting or that are contributing heavily to my turnover category. But the reality is that most of those players are coming in the early rounds anyway. I'm going to be getting a bunch of players on the back end of my draft that are not going to be contributing to that. And I like the interlocking piece of players with Garland's stat set because his areas of weakness are areas of strength for all of the big men that are going to be at the back end of drafts this year in that top 100 range, who are going to be able to bring you elite field goal percentage, rebounds, blocks, and low turnovers. So I'm going to be able to stack a lot of those players who shouldn't be going in the early rounds, who won't be going in the early rounds based on Yahoo pre-ranks. And there's a bunch of them that I like at the back of the draft, whether it's a Jakob Poeltl, an Ivica Zubats. There's so many players who are going to be able to be a puzzle piece that fit into players like Garland's weaknesses that are an exact fit to be able to fill in those holes that I'm creating, and I can get them later. So it's not just where players are weak, it's what is going to be scarce later on. And the few categories that I can fill with elite producers at the back end of a draft, those categories are field goal percentage, rebounds, and blocks. I can go get those later on from players who that might be the only thing that they do, but they're going to be able to backfill that for me, and it's available. I can't backfill points and assists and steals, or excuse me, in free throw percentage, like real contributors in free throw percentage as easily, especially in one player at the back end of a draft. But I can do it with big man stats. So that's a consideration, a reason that players like Garland with that stat set push up for me a little bit, because it's something that becomes increasingly scarce as the draft moves on.
I love that team builds. I like to pull out from the 30,000 foot view and just sort of think about how you're working your way through a draft. Matt, before we get to your third choice here, what are you working on right now? I love a good mid show promo.
Yeah. So all of my content, when I was talking about creating Dynasty resources, the big thing that I started with was Dynasty ADP, because I think one of the things that we look at here is having that guideline of how are players valued. And at a time, there was nothing like that in the Dynasty world. So how players were valued was something that was shrouded in mystery that people just kind of had to figure out based on conversations within their league. There was no consensus to be able to build around and no consensus to be able to work from for trades. So I started from that point. I built out Dynasty ADP going back historically, I think back to 2016 or 2017. I've been able to collect old drafts to be able to get an idea of how player values changed. I then built from that to be able to create Dynasty rankings, rookie draft rankings, a trade calculator, so many different things that you have in fantasy football or things that I provide. And I've created a platform on Patreon to be able to make those available, to be able to access all of it. I think we have it at $5 a month right now. And right now we have over 2,000 members on the platform. So there is a rabid community of people. If you're not on it, your league mates might be. And I think it's providing something that doesn't exist anywhere else. You can find me at patreon.com/NBA Dynasty ADP. You can join for free. There's free content on there that you can take a look at to preview and see some of the work that I'm doing. And it's a great community. We've got a bunch of people in a Discord and people chatting with me over the website itself. I love it. I love the Dynasty community. It's a big reason why I got into this, because I was finding the same people, friends through drafts and friends through different leagues, people like Rhett Bauer, just having conversations about player values. I mean, that built this community for me, and I love giving back to it.
That is awesome. By the way, your Twitter handle is also NBA Dynasty ADP. Where do you want to go next? Let's dive into number 3 here.
All right, let's go back to Oklahoma City, and I want to talk about Isaiah Hartenstein.
I also want to talk about Isaiah Hartenstein. You're in good company on that one.
So Yahoo has him at number 86, and that's kind of in this glut of centers that you're getting in kind of the mid to early late rounds in drafts based on Yahoo pre-rank. I think that there is going to be a popular opinion that Hartenstein going to Oklahoma City is a negative for his fantasy value relative to him staying in New York and doing what he did last year. And he was great in New York. Let's not get that wrong. But what he was great at last year was being a Tom Thibodeau center, which meant that he did not get to have the ball in his hands nearly as much as he should have. Now, many people might not even remember this or have been aware of it because it was on the Clippers, and who pays attention to the Clippers. But Isaiah Hartenstein has the ability to be a passing hub. And I think that is exactly why Oklahoma City brought him in, because he fits into what they want to do offensively and defensively, gives them something they don't have in both areas. And I think you're going to see him at least be a neutral in assists this year. I think you're going to see the scoring come up. And even if the minutes drop down compared to what he was doing while Mitchell Robinson was out, when he was playing minutes up into the 30s, I think even in 28 minutes, which is I think is about where he's going to settle in, because he's going to be able to play next to Chet Holmgren, because the two of them are going to be able to split up the center minutes across 48 minutes. I think you're going to see him be able to produce at a similar overall fantasy level, because the way that he is utilized and used is going to be more effective for fantasy this year. He's a guy that I would have inside of my top 50 from a per game and totals perspective. I really like him this year, and I think it's a massive value to have him at 86. This is someone that I'm willing to take around early just to make sure that I get him. I could see that number coming up, but I think there's going to be an anchor on it because of the perception. Well, is he even going to start? Can he play next to Chet? I don't have concerns about that. Oklahoma City knows exactly what they're getting out of him, and it's not just using him like Tom Thibodeau likes to use Jericho Sims or Mitchell Robinson. He's going to get fully utilized in the way that all of his skills allow. This is why they needed to be able to add a player like this. He's going to add some beef to the rebounding that they massively needed, but he's not going to take away from what they like to be able to do offensively as well. I think that's going to keep him on the floor and make him into a huge fantasy winner this year.
I have a couple of follow-up questions on this one. So last year, Hartenstein on the entire season was at 25 minutes. That was, of course, with low backup minutes and then very large starters minutes. And then he had the whole like playing 20 minutes a game because he was injured, but they wanted to keep him out there. Kind of, it was a little bit reminiscent of Tyrese Halliburton, but he managed to get through it. And he was ranked 74th in 9 category leagues in 25 minutes a game. Matt, let's say he only gets 25 minutes a game in Oklahoma City. Because of how he's being used, you think he could go higher in rank in the same number of minutes, it sounds like. Am I interpreting that right?
That's right, because I still think defensively you're going to be getting a lot of what you got from him last year. He's going to have big rebound numbers. I think he's going to have really strong field goal percentage offensively, but also you're going to get some blocks from him like you did. So that floor is there. We're going to be able to have that. I think that what you're going to be able to get in him scoring a little bit more, seeing the assist numbers come up a little bit, and that this is a guy who from the center position doesn't kill your free throw percentage category. He's going to be in the low 70s in free throw percentage. And it's nice to be able to have that usually when you're having to kind of take a bullet from the free throw percentage when you're adding centers later on in the draft. So even if the minutes are lower than I anticipate, and I think we're going to be more in the high 20s, especially given that they made this an absolute priority for them, giving him a $30 million a year contract. Yes, it was a little bit funny money because it's kind of one of their last opportunities before some of these extensions start to come due for them to be able to spend the cap space that they have. But Hartenstein is going to be a big part of their plans. They targeted him for a reason, not to be able to have him just take over the role that the other Jaylen Williams, the center Jaylen Williams, is playing and play behind Chet. They're going to use them together. And I think a lot of people don't realize yet how much more there is to Chet Holmgren. The Chet Holmgren that we saw coming up through the high school ranks, that was one of the top recruits in the country. He didn't even get to show at Gonzaga what he can do on ball, what he can do in his face-up game. I think we're going to see more of that from Chet this year, which might be a downgrade for fantasy, but it's going to open up more opportunity for Hartenstein during the Oklahoma City's 24-25 run.
That was actually going to be my other question, is what do you think he does to Holmgren? Because it does worry me a little bit.
Yeah, I think Chet's going to score more this year. And I think Chet has more offensive game than his role allowed him to be able to show last season. So there's going to be a shifting of the stat set that is probably going to, from a 9 category perspective, hurt a little bit. I still think Chet's going to block a lot of shots because Chet is gigantic and he blocks shots. He can come in from the weak side because he has the lateral quickness to be able to do it. And you're still going to have, even from my projection, 20 minutes of Chet playing center on the court without Hartenstein, if they really do just split up the center minutes to be able to allow both of them to cover them entirely. So if I'm getting that, I'm still getting blocks from Chet Holmgren. I think the rebounding could take more of a hit, and we saw inconsistency in the rebounding from Chet last year, which could be a little bit of a decrease. But I think we should see matching improvement in his assist numbers, more threes, more points. That should balance some of that out. I think Chet's still going to be a really good fantasy player. I love Chet Holmgren, but I think that this situation is really going to create a lot of opportunity for Hartenstein.
Yeah, I think I lean with you on that one. Although Chet moving down in the latest Yahoo board to the end of the second round instead of the middle of it makes that maybe a little bit of a safer call than it was before. But it sounds like you've got the scales of justice sort of balancing out. You still have two more names. I had a feeling we would go deep on a lot of these guys. I want to try to get through those last two. We can save the other ones for a future appearance, which, by the way, I can let everybody know will be happening again shortly. Matt, where do you want to go with player number 4? I think I'm counting that right.
I think that's right. I want to go a little bit deep on this one. And this is a guy that I think everybody's kind of always looking for that player that they're going to be able to get around the, outside the top 100, who might pop, who might have that really big explosion up the board. When I was on the show 3 years ago, one of the players that I was saying could make that kind of leap was Miles Bridges. And that was the season that he did, because everything aligned for Miles Bridges to be able to have a huge season. Last year, we were hyping up on our platform Jalen Johnson because we thought from a dynasty perspective, we had loved him for a while, but he just hadn't gotten the opportunity. But we had seen enough of him as a role player, a change in who he was as a player in shorter minutes, that if he got that starting opportunity with John Collins leaving, if he got to be able to play extended minutes, that he could really explode. And then he did. This year, someone that I think is now going on a little bit under the radar for multiple reasons, that the Yahoo pre-rank that I saw for him, number 144, is a Deni Avdija. So Deni Avdija last year had a little bit of a mini breakout in Washington, but it's kind of one of those situations where if a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, does it fall at all? Because unless you had Deni Avdija, you probably didn't realize anything that was going on in Washington during that stretch, because they were playing absolutely dreadful basketball. Kyle Kuzma was out for part of it. But what happened for Deni last year, this is a guy who kind of had some point forward ability, the ability to be able to dribble and pass at a good power forward size. And the shooting progressed a little bit, which was a huge swing skill for him. The volume came up a little bit. The efficiency improved during stretches. His passing ability continued to be able to show. And we got improved scoring. He's a driving monster, someone who just kind of gets to the rim at will, using his body to be able to plow ahead. And you love that ability to be able to create from a power forward in that way. What's interesting now, him getting traded away from Washington and going to Portland, I think a lot of people view that as a negative. But what I will say is this. I think Avdija has a very good chance to start. I think he almost needs to, because the players that are around him, he has an ability at his size to be able to guard players on the perimeter. He's one of the best defensive players, for his size in the NBA. He showed that last season. I think Portland made this move because they are looking at a very small backcourt between Scoot Henderson, Anthony Simons, Shaedon Sharpe. And even if they don't keep Simons in the long term, just having Scoot and Shaedon is probably going to be a poor defensive backcourt. They're going to need to be able to have someone who can handle the best wings on the other team, and even be able to keep their feet sliding to be able to stay out against other perimeter players and guards. Avdija, I think, is that perfect piece, and I think it's why they targeted him. It's why they gave up a draft pick even when they're in rebuilding mode, to be able to bring him in. He's on a really nice contract that they're going to be able to hold him for a while, and he's a guy who I think could play 30 minutes a night. And I'm not, just like I wasn't last year, he played during the tank for Washington. Even if we're in tank mode in Portland, I think you can roll out Deni Avdija without all of a sudden worrying that you're going to be picking up wins. When it's Delano Banton time again in Portland, you can still have Deni Avdija out there. So even though there's some concern that Portland's just going to take everybody out of the lineup, I think that Avdija is someone who can be able to play through that, just like he did in Washington last year, without screwing up the number of lottery balls that Portland's going to have at the end of the season.
The last month this past year, when Washington got into the silly mode a little bit, Avdija was averaging 18.5 points, 9 rebounds, 4.5 assists, 1.5 3-pointers. He shot 48% from the field. Steals and blocks were, we'll just call them sort of average. But he did struggle a bit with free throws and turnovers. Is that a thing you think he can continue to improve upon?
I think so. The free throw shooting is definitely kind of middling to slightly poor. I mean, we're talking about someone who I think can center into the mid 70s to upper 70s across his prime. The issue, of course, is that because he drives, he gets to the line a little bit more for someone of his usage that you would think that he would. I think that will continue to be probably in the slight negative category for him. And from a turnover perspective, I think some of that was the playmaking load that got put onto him in a situation in Washington by the end where there was little else out there of anyone who could create any kind of offense. So he was probably overextended in that particular role. It's nice to have that club in his bag. The fact that he can pass at his size, that he can dribble and drive at his size is an asset for him, but it's an asset in the right context, in the right amount of usage. And I think he'll be able to find that in the long term. And even this year in Portland with Jeremy Grant around him, Anthony Simons around him, and their younger players in Scoot Henderson and Shaden Sharp. He's lower in the totem pole when it comes to usage, but this is a player where I don't think that's a detriment because he's pretty solid across categories otherwise and is able to provide you a nice floor, especially for a pick that you're able to get at the very back end of the draft. And if he ends up having a big starting role, if he ends up playing 30 plus minutes a night, to get him for free at the end of drafts, I think could be a really, really nice value that pays dividends, that gets you a potential top 75 player if he continues on the trajectory that I see him on.
FBI's Matt Lawson, NBA Dynasty ADP. One more. We got one more in the tank before we wrap up today. Where do you want to finish things up?
All right. So I got to talk about one of these super young guys because, we've been kind of young, but I'm a Dynasty guy. So let's talk about somebody who could pop, who has already shown some flashes for. Now, the path is not there already, but I want to talk about Amen Thompson in Houston. Now, we've got a pre-rank of 127 here, so kind of out of the consideration, out of the thought process for most people in drafts. But with Amen Thompson, I think there's a few things at play here in Houston that people might not have realized of what happened near the end of the season. Even before Alperen Şengün got hurt, the Houston Rockets were playing at a much higher pace. The goal coming out of the All-Star break and even a little bit before it was to become a heavy transition team. And you can see why when you look at the roster. Yes, you still have Fred VanVleet and Dylan Brooks holding it down as veterans, but for the most part, this is a young and super athletic team that's going to benefit from playing the kind of defense that Ime Udoka wants them to play on one side, and they were a top 10 defense last year. And then getting out in transition and letting the athleticism of guys like Amen Thompson, Cam Whitmore, Tari Eason show. Now, this bench unit in Houston is really exciting for Dynasty people like me because you're talking about Reed Shepherd, who I'm really excited about as a rookie, Amen Thompson, Cam Whitmore, Tari Eason. Those guys are going to play a lot together. Amen is the guy that I think could transcend a little bit and eat into minutes in a lot of other places. I think that he could even play a little bit of a small ball center because that's what we saw him do last year during the Rockets run when they were beating up on some of the worst teams in the league. When Şengün went down, Amen started to play a little bit of small ball center. They were playing heavily in transition, and the stat set really popped. And that's why I like Amen. If I'm taking guys outside of the top 100, I want a stat set, a per minute stat set that is going to give me something of a lot of value if they get more minutes, if their role changes, that opportunity is going to cause them to become a very fantasy relevant player. With the men, we haven't even seen him operate as a playmaker the way that he showed that he could at Overtime Elite. That's eventually coming. That's coming when Fred VanVleet leaves. That's coming when maybe even potentially Jalen Green is gone from this team if he doesn't work out as a prospect the way that they're planning and they don't give him the rookie extension that he's going to want. But for this year, I think Amen Thompson's going to be able to bring you some of the most steals in the league on a per minute basis. I think he's an extremely strong rebounder from a per minute perspective. The field goal percentage was really strong, especially as the season went on last year. And you're getting at least neutral assist and block numbers. Now, you're not going to get the most scoring out of him. The shooting is wonky. But this is a guy who's going to be a fantasy star in the long term. He's someone who there's the biggest delta between their dynasty value, the way that they're perceived in dynasty versus redraft. And these are the kind of guys that I want to bring onto the radar of redraft people because the dynasty world sees this trajectory going toward fantasy stardom. It might not be this year, but you're getting them for free at the back end of a draft now. And if he gets to play minutes up into the upper 20s because he starts eating away from others because of the utility of what he can do on the court, then suddenly you could be looking at someone who goes up into fantasy relevance, pushes into that top 100, maybe even into the top 75, depending on how high the minutes go. And that is where you can get a lot of value for a guy that you're getting at the very end of your draft.
Yeah, in 26.5 minutes a game, the last 2 months of this past season, he was top 80 in 9 category leagues. Some of those games were with and some were without Şengün. Is he, Matt, do you think he's the first person off the bench for this team? Because like you talked about, they have a really strong bench. Whitmore, Thompson, Reed Shepherd, Tari Eason. That's a lot of guys to sort through. But if you're the first one off the bench, that basically means if anybody goes down, you're the first person to eat into it. Has he, you think, already jumped those other guys? Because, I mean, it's not like he has to clear many veterans to get there.
I think so because of his ability to kind of be a utility man here. He has an ability to play as a wing if needed. He has an ability to be able to play a little bit of a small ball, big role. And he has enough playmaking and handling ability to be able to operate also on the perimeter and to create some offense. So there's a lot of different players on this team that he can fill in for off of the bench. I think it makes him kind of an ideal sixth man for them. And he brings a lot of defensive intensity, which I think is what Ime Udoka is going to value above all else for who is going to get the most minutes coming off of this Rockets bench.
Do you think Tari Eason has a path this year? Because dude can rebound and steal like nobody's business.
I love Tari. I think the Dylan Brooks problem is still there. I mean, if he's not,
it's Dylan Brooks' problem, isn't it?
I think eventually, Tari's a guy who, again, there's a big delta between where we view him in Dynasty and where he's viewed in redraft right now because he's blocked. But Tari, I think he will, and already did to some degree, endear himself to Ime Udoka. I think that he's going to have the opportunity to eat into Brooks. If we get another season like a couple ago where Dylan just can't hit a shot, last year Dylan hit enough shots to be able to keep himself out there and make his defense worthwhile. But that defense is only going to play as long as he continues to be able to provide enough offensively. Tari's a guy who's eventually going to take over for him. I believe in Tari Eason as a long-term starter in the league, and he's someone that I think should be held on to dearly in dynasty leagues. I hope that it happens this season, but having Jabari Smith Jr. already taking up a big load at power forward, having Dylan Brooks kind of playing as the other forward spot leaves little for Tari Eason to be able to work his way into. But I see a possibility of him to overtake Brooks at some point. If it's not this year, I think it could be next.
Yeah, we want it, but shucks, it's probably not imminent. I know you got a laundry list of other stuff, but we're going to save that because that's the magic of radio. We'll tease it to the next one. Matt Lawson at NBA Dynasty ADP. I got to say, man, it was good to have this conversation not in your own head anymore. This is a lot of fun for me. Let me get Amen Thompson off the screen for folks on YouTube so they can see your face and see your information there. Next time, I'm going to make sure you put your Twitter handle on the screen for everybody to see. But again, that's NBA Dynasty ADP. Matt, your brain is a special thing, and I'm glad we got to share it today. Thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thanks for making this an interactive experience for me. I enjoyed getting to have a dialogue. Thanks, Dan.
Can we do it again soon?
Let's do it.
Man, that is a sharp dude. That is a sharp damn dude. These Dynasty folks, they see things a special way. I always come away from shows with Rhett and with Matt, and I know with Matt it's been a while, but like I come away from these shows just like seeing things differently. And I love that. I love that they're able to sort of open up our eyes to things the way that, because when you're watching for the next 5 years, you have a different set of angles you have to look at than when you're watching for the next 5 months. Maybe I should say 6 years versus 6 months or whatever. So to understand what the Thunder want to do, what the Rockets want to do, what the Cavs want to do, what a coach wants to do, all of these things are intensified when you look over that long term, where for me, doing just a standard redraft show, I don't really have to pay that much attention to Reed Shepherd. We know that he has a fantastic fantasy game, but we also know that he's buried. He's like probably the 7th or 8th, probably the 8th man, maybe 9th on that Rockets team. He's good, but he's rookie. And you've got, as we talked about, Whitmore, second year, Amen Thompson, second year. Tari Eason, third year. There's guys that are just in front. And then there's veterans floating around. I think they brought Aaron Holiday back. Can't remember what the hell they did at backup center. Doesn't really matter. But like that's the kind of thing that someone in Dynasty, they have to know the contract status of all those guys. They have to know what the Rockets are trying to do, where he's going to fit, what's the Jalen Green situation going to look like. Where for us, it's nice to know those things, but we don't have to in this moment. But what it does is it gives us a unique perspective on how to assess what's going to happen over each chunk of time. Time is, we can look at it in sort of quanta, packets of time. What's 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years? And there's value in that. I also think that some of what we talked about on today's show, and just in case you guys forgot some of the names that went over, Amen Thompson was the last one. We can kind of work backwards from this one. Deni Avdija before him, Darius Garland, and the first two, Isaiah Hartenstein and Jaylen Williams. Those are the big five we talked about on today's show. And the interesting thing, too, is they fit in different formats a little bit differently. Darius Garland is a high turnovers guy. You just kind of have to come to terms with that a little bit. Even if it's not 3.8 or like he was over 4 for a little stretch last year, it's going to be on the higher side. And they are high turnover guys that go in the first round. They do more than Garland does, but he's kind of the last high turnover, high assist guy on the board. Hartenstein, what does his role look like? Deni Avdija, perhaps he doesn't fit your roto build. It's possible. But as Matt was talking about, is he a guy that has room to grow? What if? We talk sometimes, and I think it parallels nicely to yesterday's show with Alex Rickling, who was arguing that Anthony Edwards has a gear we haven't seen yet. And I was arguing, I don't see where that gear comes from. It's hard to see. Like with Anthony Edwards, field goal percent is kind of the last thing that could really change. Where with Deni Avdija, and like there's a big difference here. One of these guys is going early second round. The other one is going late 12th round. With Avdija, there are a few things that we pointed out in real time, or I've tried to point out in real time. Steals, blocks, probably not going to change much, but the points, rebounds, assists, that's a good trajectory. His field goal percent's been improving. But Avdija has a big hole in his free throw percent, and he's a relatively high turnover guy. If either of those things fixes, course corrects, there's a path. If both, and sometimes we don't see two things at the same time, but you can understand why there's a shot worth taking late in a draft on someone like that. As opposed to, say, and I've been a big fan of like Kentavious Caldwell-Pope. I called him Kentavious Caldwell-Pope. I'm leaving that in the podcast because I said on yesterday's show I have a rectal fixation, and now you guys know it's true. Someone like KCP has almost no chance of getting above number 85 this year. That's like an absolute best case scenario for him. But the worst case scenario for KCP is like 120 because he's going to play big minutes. Orlando gave him a bunch of money to go play big minutes. He does what they need. He spaces the floor. He's great defensively. Orlando loves that kind of stuff. But it's not like he's going to go out there and get a dozen shots a ball game. There is no big role change that's about to happen. In a lot of situations, KCP is a guy worth putting on your fantasy team because maybe you have a few risks earlier in your draft, or maybe on a head-to-head side, if you have a few risks that might miss games, you need someone that you can just plug in, take him in the 12th round, and say, you know what, I can just leave this guy in. He's going to play like a 9th or 10th rounder all season long. It's going to be boring as hell, but he's going to give me steals. He's going to give me some threes. He's going to give me free throw. He's not going to ruin me anywhere, and he's just going to plod along and be solid. But maybe you have a team that's a little bit more solid already. The 12th round, take a shot on Avdija. Maybe he doesn't fix those things, but maybe there's a team out there in your league that, say, is punting free throws. Maybe his free throws stays bad, and he goes to the line 5 times and it's 74% of them. That's bad. Maybe that hurts your team in a way that you didn't want it to. Maybe your team is good at free throws, but you know who isn't? Someone. There's probably a team in your league that'll be punting foul shots or turnovers or whatever, and you can go get better value. So there's a lot of ways to look at these guys, and it's always fun to hear from our guests, especially ultra sharp ones like Matt Lawson, NBA Dynasty ADP. So big thank you to Matt again. I agree with a number of names on that list. Like, I couldn't even argue with him, even the tiniest bit on a few of them, even perhaps if it might have been fun to just see if I could prod him along a little bit. But you could hear the knowledge. I could hear the knowledge, and I hope that we all enjoyed this one. Coming up later on today, we're going to have a live, well, okay, so the show won't be live. It's going to be recorded, but it's going to be a live mock. So it'll be a show done in real time. Myself, Adam King, will be together on that one. And Between Two Dans, Adam's show has an episode today. I will be guesting on it, so I can promo that today as well. It'll be me, it'll be Dan Titus, it'll be Adam King on Between Two Dans. We have some very funny topics coming up on that one. Make sure to like and subscribe. I think I forgot to say that at the front end, but hopefully by now you guys have figured that out. Hit like if you're watching on YouTube, subscribe no matter where you're taking it in. And if you have a moment, please 5-star review on Apple or Spotify. It really does go a long way. And thank you to everybody that's done those so far. Enjoy the next few hours of your delightful Wednesday. I'm sure it's quite delightful right now. I'm Dan Besbris at Dan Besbris on Twitter, at Old Man Squad. Give that one a follow as well. Thanks again to Matt. I'll see you guys in a few hours.